You could go ahead, Michael.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. And welcome to the second, as you can see on the screen, of the European Union Studies Program Faculty Development seminars for this fall. Once again, these are organized for us and hosted by the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. And this program is also co-funded by the European Union, by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union. And before introducing today's speaker and topic, that's Adam Stulberg, who's going to talk on Europe's energy crisis and Russia's weaponization of energy. I want to remind you of the third and final seminar in the series that's coming up a week from today on October 20th. And that's going to be a panel discussion, as you can see on your screen, on Russia's war in Ukraine and the European Union. So I hope you'll join us for that one as well. But to today's topic and speaker, and today's topic, of course, also concerns the impact of the Ukraine war on the EU. But Dr. Adam Stulberg is our speaker today, and he is the Sam Nunn Professor and Chair in the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses on international security, Russia, Eurasian politics and security affairs, nuclear nonproliferation, and energy and international security, as well as interdisciplinary courses on science, technology, and international security policy. His current research focuses on the geopolitics of oil and gas networks, energy security dilemmas, and statecraft in Eurasia, Russia, and gray zone conflicts, new approaches to strategic stability, internationalization of the nuclear fuel cycle, and implications of emerging technologies for strategic stability and international security. That's quite a research agenda, Adam. Dr. Stulberg earned his PhD in political science from the University of California, Los Angeles. And he also holds an MA in international affairs from Columbia University, an MA in political science from UCLA, and a BA in history from the University of Michigan. He's, among other activities, he's worked closely with former Senator Sam Nunn, drafting policy recommendations and background studies on future directions for the U.S. Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, building regional and energy security regimes in Central Asia and the South Caucasus, and engaging Russia's regional power centers. Dr. Stulberg has authored and edited 5 books, and he has published widely in leading academic and policy journals. So with that, I want to welcome Dr. Adam Stulberg and thank you for joining us today and speaking on this very crucial and important topic.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Alistair, for inviting me to this forum. And let me just pull up some slides here, make sure I'm not all thumbs. Are we good? Okay. Great. Well, like I said, thank you very much. This is obviously a very dynamic moment to be thinking about Europe's energy predicament, and especially the Russian dimension. If you recall, let me see how, for the last 30 years or so, we've been on caught up in a debate over the nature of whether or not energy really is a weapon of statecraft. And in essence, it has really been, taken us back to that old Soviet line, which is, Kto Kovo, who's getting over whom. And, on the one hand, there's been a large discussion, really almost since the collapse of the Soviet Union, that Russia has been resorting to energy as a cudgel for exerting non-commercial influence over customers, primarily Europe. And some have even taken it as far as to suggest that energy really is a substitute for its conventional power and other elements of lost strategic stature. It is an instrument to restore Russia's great power credentials, as well as its preserve over its sphere of influence. On the other hand, over the last 15 years or so, there's been an alternative perspective that has looked at the rise of the EU in the energy space. And of course, all of you know the EU really stemmed from the energy domains. But over the last decade or so, we've seen with the liberalization of prices, the requirement for unbundling and the removal of destination clauses on Russian supply, that the EU has really developed a number of strong institutional levers to exert the power of its market over suppliers. And so there's been this big debate whether or not, again, energy has been weaponized and by whom. Well, let me just kind of cut to the chase to talk a little bit about, where I see it, and then I'll sort of unravel some of these points. At the heart of this debate has really been sort of a realist perspective as opposed to a sort of an institutionalist or neoliberal perspective on how to think about international affairs. And I would argue that when it comes to energy, those two perspectives have really been quite Spartan in explaining the mixed dimensions of energy statecraft and success of using energy as an instrument of statecraft. And the real story has been how states have used interdependence and their position within an energy interdependent set of relationships to exert influence. So it's not power versus independence, it's power within interdependence. At the same time, I would argue, certainly over the last decade and a half, the writing has been on the wall as to whether or not energy would be an instrument of effective influence for Russia. I think there's great debate, and I've written on this for a number of years, as to really how successful Russia has been at using energy, specifically oil and natural gas, but also to some extent commercial nuclear, as an instrument of influence. And I think they've had mixed success. But I think the writing's been on the wall for a while that to the extent that it was providing any influence for statecraft, that was going to be waning. And as a result, I would argue that we've been witnessing, really since 2014, a shift from really trying to exert influence through markets, through energy infrastructure relationships, to pivoting towards using energy as part of a broader strategy of long-term competition, if not confrontation, as part of this next generation warfare that I'll talk about. And as a result, I think that we are now at a clear pivot point with the February the launching of Russia's aggression into Ukraine. And now we are really at a punctuated point. I think like I said, since 2014, I think we were gradually moving in this direction. I think we have, the door has been closed and going back. And I think Russia is going to have much less leverage with energy moving forward. And the whole paradigm, I think, is shifting. But that doesn't mean that the EU is out of being affected by Russia, because as we enter this new period, I would argue that the challenge for the EU is to transcend what some people call the energy trilemma, which is balancing the interests in energy security, national security, and sustainability. So I want to unpack some of this, but I see this primarily as laying some issues on the table that we can then engage in conversation. So let's talk a little bit about sort of Putin's energy diplomacy prior to 2014. And I would argue that upon consolidating his power within the Kremlin and within the Russian leadership, the focus was primarily on using energy as an instrument for forging vertical control over the commanding heights, if you will, of the national economy. And so, and then over time, the focus was on using energy as a driver for innovation and international competitiveness. So I think very early on for the Putin administration, the focus was really on building Russia up from within. But I think as reflected in the broader shift in Russia's foreign policy and strategic posture in the early 2000s, you began to see energy become part of the fulcrum of Russia's efforts to strategically assert itself, especially in its former Soviet space. And this became energy and its position, especially given the high oil prices at the time, was seen as a potential competitive advantage and allow focus on really pushing out foreign influence in the former Soviet space and ultimately standing up to, sort of Western domination across other dimensions of foreign policy. And this was reflected in a variety of different approaches and tactics, if you will, and primarily using energy prices, using Russia's relatively cheap production and marginal cost advantages of production to secure market share, especially in its established markets in Europe, to then diversify that hold, not only within Europe, in terms of establishing multiple pipelines. Here's where South Stream, Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2, Turkish Stream pipelines were building the southern corridor, tapping into the southern corridor with South Stream, were a part of that effort, but also to diversify their customer base, especially in the Far East, ultimately with the strategy of playing off West and East. However, as I'll mention later, that didn't quite work that way. But the other element of the strategy was to not just focus on being the supplier to Europe, but also to become an owner of downstream assets, especially with respect to storage facility, as well as those pipelines that I mentioned. We did see the resort to disruption in supply, especially in 2006 and 2009. What's interesting in 2014 is not all the gas supply was cut off, at least by Russia's behest, but there were some cutoffs, and we saw some dramatic resort to energy statecraft during this pre-2014 period. But also another instrument of Russia's energy leverage during that period was reflective of how energy has been used by other states, including the United States, actually coming out of World War II, where we used our foreign tax laws as ways of inducing and creating incentives for companies to align their business interests with our national security interests. Well, Russia did the same in creating a new state company in the oil sector that consolidated the state control over the oil sector, but also gave a mandate to that Rosneft, that national oil company, to play in the natural gas space, especially with respect to new field developments, and also to approve the formation of Novatek, a private natural gas company, to compete with Gazprom, the state company, in the development of LNG. In other words, to stoke some competition without creating a race to the bottom effect, which was the case with the oil sector prior in the early 1990s. So facilitating internal competition and also playing with the tax laws to create incentives for different investments in new field development and to cover profits and exports. And this was actually very important in the natural gas sector, where they were also requiring the natural gas company to subsidize internal consumption. So they were trying to also create incentives for Gazprom to sell their gas abroad to recoup some of those losses. So that said, I think throughout that period, there were a bunch of what I would call myths about Russia's energy leverage that I think we have to keep in mind as we're thinking about moving into the current period. One, we would refer to Russia as an energy superpower, and we can talk about this and more later, but in essence, Russia has historically been really a regional gas power, especially in Europe, and a price taker in oil. In other words, which is really interesting because they earn their rents that feed into the budget from the oil sector, but they don't control international prices. They're not a swing producer like Saudi Arabia. So they're a price taker. They have very little control. And in fact, as I've written before, their efforts to play or use and leverage their oil sector, either through prices or supply, have failed miserably. But in regional gas, until the sort of early 2000s, was primarily dominated by pipelines that were very fixed and had fixed relationships. They were at times effective in wrangling better prices, recouping debts, securing debt equity, and a number of other elements of their policy. So, and they were a quite significant supplier, as you well know, to Europe. And as a result, they're more of a region. They've been more of a regional gas player, but that situation has changed with the fact that they've faced incremental competition with other pipelines, such as the discussion about building out the southern gas corridor, as well as the emergence of LNG, and especially LNG coming from the United States. But ultimately, their stature as a global energy player has been confounded by a number of structural constraints that have been reflected by limited investment in new field development, decaying fields, decaying infrastructure, inefficient production, and the fact that their infrastructure has been concentrated around established fields in let's see, I'll show you in the Western Siberia area. If you look on this screen, the sort of green, the fields on the west, on the left side, they're really dominated by the pipeline infrastructure that is drawn to the west. But the new field development in East Siberia and the Far East, they have very little infrastructure development. So, trying to play off East and West has been a real challenge because there's been very limited infrastructure, and it's been quite, expensive. And Gazprom, the state gas company, has been loath to invest in that infrastructure and focus more on creaming off of the former Soviet investments. So there are those issues to keep in mind. Similarly, we have to remember, even with respect to their established markets in Europe, which, they supply, 35, 40% of the annual consumption in Europe. But Europe constitutes 90% of Russia's hard currency earnings from energy exports. So who's dependent on whom is a big question. There are also some interesting dynamics between the legacy pipelines that Russia inherited from the Soviet Union, which were those big cross-border transmission pipelines, gas and oil coming from Western Siberia into Europe, where there's been really no focus on return on investment, which is something unique in the energy space. And so Russia's been able to compete very favorably because their marginal costs of production are a lot lower. But when it comes to new pipelines from the Caspian Pipeline Consortium that goes from the Caspian and Kazakhstan through Russia to Europe, or some of the other new pipelines, Nord Stream pipelines, Blue Stream pipelines, they've been loath until very recently to cut those off because there has been a focus on return on investment, and they need to recoup the investments from their European markets. And this is especially the case in the gas sector, where the domestic market is heavily subsidized. So there's a big question of who's dependent on whom, and that question has really become front and center with the rise of LNG and diversified supply coming into Europe. Another myth has to do with the relationship between Gazprom and the state. And we sort of, there's been this, the former prime minister of Russia, Viktor Chernomyrdin, used to, call Nash Dom Gazprom, right? Our home is Gazprom, which was sort of just like what's good for GM is good for the country, which was the, the maxim here. But, even though Gazprom and then later Rosneft are state companies, they have very different mandates. And that's not to say their interests aren't convergent with the state, but they're not the same. As I mentioned, Gazprom has been saddled with a lot of loss-making activities, such as subsidies to retail and also industrial consumers at home. There's been battle over ownership and control in the oil sector. Previously, the oil sector was one of the first sectors that was privatized in the 90s. Then they reconstituted and renationalized some of the, restatized, I should say, a number of the oil companies, and they formed this large Rosneft state company. But they've given that company a mandate both in the oil and natural gas sector, so it competes a little bit with Gazprom. Also, there's the pipeline monopoly, Transneft, that battles with both Rosneft and the private oil interest. And so there are a lot of rivalries, not to mention the private Novatek interest that's interested in developing and getting involved in the LNG space, where Gazprom is heavily invested in the brownfields and in the pipeline infrastructure. So there are differences, and the government has at times sided with some of these interests over others, and you know, not completely on the same page. And there's been a lot of frustration, even with Putin, with some of the corruption and the lost revenues within the respective state energy companies. And there have been different bouts of efforts to try to extract some of those rents. Another issue has to do with the Asian redux. As I mentioned, increasingly Asia has resonated on the radar as an alternative market, not, you know, way before February of this year. You know, the current energy strategy towards 2035 has identified selling about 35% of Russian oil and gas to East Asia. But there have been a lot of constraints on that. One has been that Russia historically has been leery about becoming a resource appendage of China. There's, especially in the Russian Far East, there's a lot of resentment, and this gets to some of the domestic political challenges of wielding some of the energy resources, especially in those new fields in Eastern Siberia and the Russian Far East that would be tailored towards China in particular. Historically, Russia has looked mostly to the West to modernize the energy sector and investments, especially when it comes to getting technology for offshore deep sea drilling, like in the Arctic new fields or under the permafrost in the East, Siberia and in the Russian Far East. So that's been a constraint on how interested Russia has become in tying their future to China. Also, China has played its own hedging game. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind is that China has historically been very careful about investing everything into pipelines. In fact, they are primarily importing LNG. So the opportunity space for Gazprom's traditional pipeline approach, either through the Power of Siberia or the discussion of Power of Siberia 2, is quite limited because China has been very careful to maintain its diversified relations. It also has established pipelines and partnerships in Central Asia, but is heavily involved in the LNG trading space, something that Gazprom it's not its strength. So that's a challenge for them. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, there's something to keep in mind, which is how effective has energy statecraft been? And we can dispute this, but the bottom line is there's at best there's been mixed results, and towards what ends. And there's some research that shows that they use energy for a variety of ways, and it's not always in a negative coercive manner, but they also use it for positive inducements, through subsidies. And you can see that that's really been the primary way that Russia has used energy, especially in the former Soviet space. There have been attempts at cutoffs, both with oil and natural gas, but really during the heyday of that period, those cutoffs it's not clear if they were a sign of success. One, if you're talking about using energy to threaten or coerce, actually having to follow through with a cutoff would signify the failure of that strategy. But beyond the intellectual dimension to it, there's been very little evidence that Russia's cutoffs have led to the acquiescence of a state, and mostly it's provoked diversification of the customer state. So again, it's been even if you buy the argument that energy and natural gas in particular has been a cudgel, it's had mixed success in the best of circumstances. The other thing to keep in mind, it has to do with the nature of the dependency. And, this is the image we have of Russia's, steel umbilical cord of, in creating dependence in Europe. But in fact, the landscape looks much more like this. It is much more of a network situation. And really, over the last decade or so, Europe has spent a lot of effort building out its interconnectors. And as a result, you have energy networks that exist that allow for much more flexibility. Yes, there are several hubs and, Poland-German borders and in Italy and Austria and Hungary. There's some important nodes, but there's much more flexibility to link up the blue dots, which are some of the LNG terminals that historically have been stranded and not part of sort of the heart of Western and Central Europe. And that provides Europe with much more flexibility. And that doesn't mean there aren't transaction costs and economic costs of switching, but existentially, energy has lost its lever in many ways. And by the way, this is not just a infrastructure set of networks. They're also about relationships. And this is a hand-drawn image with the Bulgarian prime minister was trying to make the case to the EU president that Bulgaria was actually an energy hub. And he was describing the importance in this energy network. So it's not just materially understood to be the case. This has now been cognitively absorbed as a network context. So our realist, sort of neoliberal focus, I think, is really missing a lot of what the dynamics are in the energy space. And ultimately, in this interdependent relationship, there's strategic interaction here. And you can see there are winners and losers in these different relationships. And this was a study that was done that looked at, if you think about the top half of each cell is the costs, and the bottom half of each cell, the effects, and then red is sort of high costs and green or low costs. You can see that in the short term, Russia actually, to cut off the EU, they could do it, but it would be very costly to them. But over time, the EU actually has acquired through diversification, other means of responding to make it even more costly for Russia. Actually, the same has been true with Ukraine, and this is well before the current war. So again, just as a background, I think it's important to think in terms of network, strategic interaction, and there's a mutual dependency here that needs to be kept in mind. That said, I would argue that since 2014, we've entered a new period in the way that Russia thinks about energy as an instrument of diplomacy. And I would argue that it's gone away from thinking about an ad hoc, instrument that could be, that they would look to manipulate prices or market share for political influence, or occasionally shut off pipelines as part of a foreign policy. Now, I would argue that energy has been integrated into a broader conception of long-term competition and what they call next generation warfare that is really aimed at sort of cross-domain coercion that is part of a broader strategy of strategic deterrence that incorporates elements of compellence, deterrence, and containment that really puts an emphasis on manipulating the adversary in this long-term competition using different instruments of power. And so if you sort of look at this coercive approach to Russia, you can see how they use different instruments over time in this space. You can see that Europe, especially Central Europe, has been a big focal point for their economic statecraft, which is frankly not the biggest part of their statecraft, but energy is the primary focus there. And it's primarily been a way that they've tried to exert cross-domain coercion over other countries there. And this whole approach to the gray zone is really about shrinking and blurring the lines between peace and war, such that they're bringing energy as one of a number of instruments to bear to both manipulate, to deter, and ultimately contain Western or adversarial interests. So this is much more now integrated into, I would argue, this approach to what they call next generation warfare, which has energy as yet another lever like diplomatic demarches, and even using subconventional and conventional military force to exert influence. And it's part, therefore, this is a data on Putin's different statements, red line statements. And you see the uptick really in 2019 and 2021, in particular in 2022, and that really maps onto where we've seen a shift. It's no longer really about price. Now they're cutting off flows and practicing a number of other techniques. And this is, and I would argue the energy and the current crisis leading up to the current war has probably been less about pipelines and more about constraining Europe's ability to fill its storage facilities. And as part of this longer term competition where the war in Ukraine is part of that thing. So there's been a bunch of fundamental inflection, I think, in the nature of energy statecraft. Now we've seen the sanctions, which you all know well. There have been reciprocal currency payment restrictions. There's been a concerted effort to try to redirect exports to Asia by establishing a new pipeline. They call it Power of Siberia 2. But again, this is a long-term proposition. This isn't going to happen overnight. And there are constraints on both the Indian and the Chinese markets. There are infrastructure constraints. There's protracted demand uncertainty, especially in China. There's price volatility. There's also supply diversity that Russia would have to compete against. So it's not clear that Russia's attempts to diversify, create new markets, create new hubs like in Turkey are going to play out, but this has really become a focal point. Obviously, we've seen discussions about price caps in Europe. There's some concern about OPEC plus and a convergence of interests between Saudi Arabia and Russia that the Biden administration has seen very much as part of this long-term strategic competition, as opposed to strictly an energy dimension. And I would argue what's really fundamentally changed in since 2014, and really with the war, has been Russia's reputation as a reliable supplier. And I think the best manifestation of that has been the breakup of the corporate strategic relationships and a shifting dynamic. This was sort of how important Gazprom was to other companies doing business in the European space. You could see that Gazprom was a trusted corporate alliance partner for the companies that were doing business in the core European gas markets. And this was really throughout the 2000s. And this was actually pre-2006. You can see, this is just looking in Northern Europe, and you can see how central the orange node Gazprom was to the blue nodes, which are German companies and et cetera. So you can see that Gazprom was very much seen as a trusted party prior to 2006. What's interesting is we saw the first gas cutoff to Europe, and during that, following that that cutoff, Gazprom became even more of a valued partner to German companies and even the purple companies, which are Polish companies, which via the Polish companies' relationship with Russia. And this was after 2009. Those ties became even deeper. So this, gives you a distinct, this can explain some of the curious puzzles that we saw these conspicuous episodes of gas cutoffs in 2006 to 2009, but Russia came back increasingly strong after those things. And big part of it was that Gazprom was seen as a trusted corporate alliance partner to prominent energy interests in Europe. And I don't have the slide to show you, but the real question here is, and what we're seeing with the de-risking of companies, the nationalization of Rosneft's assets in Germany, and European assets and American assets and Asian assets in Russia, is a breaking of these corporate relationships, and a fundamental breaking, I would argue, of Russia's reputation as a reliable supplier, something that they had been cultivating since the 1950s via Germany and Australia in particular, and Austria in particular. So I would argue then Russia is really, the writing was on the wall, as I mentioned, with the energy transition in Europe. and with a number of the challenges that Russia made to shift energy really as an instrument of this long-term approach to competition and confrontation, and their approach to even what they call next generation warfare, as opposed to just an instrument of foreign policy and foreign economic policy that was the case prior to 2014. Now, the challenge for Europe, and we can talk more about this, is how do they, they seem to be confronted with this dilemma. Do they now, as they enter the winter, do they focus on building out and insulating themselves from Russia's hard use of natural gas in particular, or do they accelerate the energy transition? And they're right now, it seems like they haven't made a decision on this, and they're making efforts to try to manage some of these trade-offs by looking to diversify supply, especially from alternative LNG suppliers. They're going to need to reduce demand beyond the 10%, 9 to 10% pledges to get through. The real crunch is going to be in February. You can see the sort of IEA's estimates that even though the reserves are about 90% full now, the real challenge is going to be what happens in February, and that's going to require a combination of LNG supply, greater LNG supply, but also reduced consumption. And there's tremendous variation here. The Netherlands, Latvia, and Slovakia are sort of leading the charge, whereas Switzerland, Germany, and Norway tend to have not met those targets. So there's going to be some challenges there. But I would argue that the way to really transcend this trade-off is to really think in a transformational way and think about renewable hydrocarbons, such that and this involves, biofuels and synthetics, where you're actually taking, carbon out of the atmosphere, converting it into liquids, using the liquid infrastructure to generate clean energy, and then and that would leverage the existing transport and storage infrastructure while continuing along the pace to the energy transition, standing up new production with renewables, and plugging nuclear power and a 21st century Ukraine as a nuclear power into that infrastructure to power that renewable hydrocarbon structure. And we can talk more about that. So let me stop now, but because I've laid a number of things on the table, and I'd love to get your impressions.
Okay, I guess we're open for questions now. Thank you, Adam. That was a wonderful presentation. You did put a lot on the table. Those of you who are participating or have joined us as participants, that is EU Studies Program representatives, you can ask questions directly. Everybody else, I believe, will have to use the chat function to ask a question, if I'm not mistaken. So we'll open it up for questions. Are there any questions that you have for Adam? Yeah, so I'll begin, Adam. From the EU perspective, it's quite clear that any advantage or leverage that they have really ultimately rests upon their degree of unity or solidarity among EU countries, and to the extent that they can present a united front, they're going to have a lot of leverage, and they'll probably be able to pursue a more successful strategy to get through this crisis. But I'm sure the great concern is that the EU countries won't be able to maintain that degree of unity, that there will be cracks in the facade that the Russian government and Vladimir Putin will be able to exploit. And evidence of this, I guess, comes today, where I think at a meeting in St. Petersburg, Vladimir Putin, or maybe it was yesterday, but he offered to renew flows of gas through the Nord Stream, I think, 1 pipeline, which is still effective or not, hasn't been damaged, and invited European countries to to turn on the tap, so to speak, and take advantage of that. So clearly hoping that one or more EU countries will break from this united front and try to increase their gas supplies that way. So I just wonder what your reading is of the potential for the EU to maintain a united front here, and the possibility that the Putin regime will be able to divide Europe and take advantage of their very justified concerns about energy security this winter.
Well, I mean, this is obviously the big question, but I think to date, the Russians have gotten it all wrong. I mean, EU has been quite resilient in sticking together during the fall lead up to the war, and since then, in rallying behind every time they escalate. And I would argue, again, the Nord Stream sabotage, although we don't know exactly who did it, I think if you look at it in the context of Russia's next generation warfare, I think it's reflective of the fact that Russia has kind of given up on Europe being a long-term market. And they're trying to exert some pressures, trying to find some points. And so by, if they are indeed responsible for these explosions, there are ways of demonstrating the lengths that they're willing to go, that all pipelines are potentially vulnerable. And I think all of this is only forcing the EU member states. Slovakia is in a very difficult situation, yet they are, out of necessity, pushing to reduce their demand and consumption to get through the winter. And so, yes, there'll be some challenges that Hungary may present, but I think these are going to be increasingly, Russia's taking increasingly drastic steps that I think is actually bringing Europe more and more together. And there's more diversity in terms of an optionality in the system, not only in terms of external suppliers, but switching fuels within Europe. And this gets to what I think is the real story here about Europe that distinguishes it from 2009 in the fears that this kind of crisis or this kind of war would have precipitated then versus now, is that they built out these interconnectors. And these interconnectors allow for gas to flow to where there is different demands. And yes, there'll be different rates of performance on meeting targets to reduce demand, but there are also different options. Italy is a gas sink for Europe, and gas can go in many different directions. So I think that the ability to use gas beyond the very short term, for short-term effect is waning. And even those short-term effects are being overtaken by this increasingly dramatic resort to heavy-handed approaches that are making it almost unviable for even the most dependent countries to make the case that they can rely on Russia, because their reputation now is totally shot. That's what saved them. It was so critical to driving the rise of détente and weathering the end of the 1970s and the storm with the rise of the Reagan administration and through the difficulties of the transition in the post-Soviet space. But that's what's really been broken, I would argue. And I think it's going to be hard for them to leverage any of the dissension that we will see. But I think it's paled in comparison to the risks of working with Russia on energy issues moving forward.
We have some questions, and Alistair, would you like me to read them, or do you?
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, the first one is from Juliet Abkari, and she says, excellent presentation. Could Dr. Stulberg follow up on his final point about Ukraine and nuclear power in the future?
Okay, well, thanks, Juliet. I mean, the point I'm making here is when I've talked to several Ukrainians, I've actually talked to the head of the nuclear energy, their regulatory commission there, and since during the war, and the vision is to rebuild the nuclear complex and to tie it into Europe and tie it into the different grids. And I would argue that, and in many ways, Ukraine was really at the cusp of many things, because one thing that Ukraine did before this whole war that I think is lost is Ukraine changed their technologies such that they can accept fuels from a variety of suppliers, nuclear fuel. Most nuclear fuel is tailored to particular nuclear reactors. They made some innovations that allowed them to take nuclear fuel, let's say, from a non-Russian supplier, because their nuclear plants were built by the Soviet Union, and they have more flexibility. So their thinking is they want to, leverage that flexibility and plug into the European grid moving forward. And I would argue, obviously, we know nuclear power by itself has, let's just say, a spotted record in Europe, and there's spotted interest. But the real future for nuclear, I would argue, is to plug into an all of the above architecture, like I was mentioning, which would be this sort of renewable hydrocarbons. Now, if there's a question there, I'm agnostic about which technologies, to be it biofuels or direct air capture and conversion or hydrogen and ammonia. The point is to leverage the existing liquids infrastructure to transport and to store fuel, but that's going to need power to generate that. And that can be the nuclear capabilities. And Ukraine, which is it's a very open environment for nuclear, provides opportunity to power some of that infrastructure, not only to plug directly into grids, that can give a new lease on and a wider expansion, footprint for nuclear, and make investments today in natural gas and interconnectors to help defang Russia's efforts, such that they're not stranded assets. They're actually part of the energy transition in leveraging them this way. So that's how I see nuclear. I'm worried that we're going to just try to rebuild Ukraine the way it was, just oriented westward, as opposed to thinking in the 21st century, how does nuclear fit into a energy transition infrastructure?
Okay, and let me skip down to the fourth question here, because it's related to this issue of energy technologies. Simon Key asks, why synthetic hydrocarbons as opposed to green hydrogen? My impression is that governments and companies have put their resources behind green hydrogen.
Yeah, and I mean, you're right to date, and that may be the way to go. Although there are some challenges with hydrogen. I mean, it's quite volatile, again, I'm agnostic on what the actual approach is. I think this is where I think we should be focusing a lot of our attention is, should we do it through chemical processing and creating synthetic fuels or should we use hydrogen ammonia as carriers? I mean, this is where the attention really needs to be paid, because there are a lot of innovations that are on the cusp, but all of them share one point, which is my major one, which is leveraging the liquids infrastructure that already exists, rather than thinking only about the renewable sources and then having to build another set of transmission and storage facilities that really are not going to be cost effective and going to force EU countries to really be on the horns of the dilemma. So I would argue whether or not it's green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, or direct air capture and conversion, these all offer opportunities. The one thing about direct air capture is nice is that everybody can participate in the climate change efforts, and you can get off the dime and actually generate a profit anywhere by creating these facilities, these utilization facilities. So that may be an added benefit of that, but I'm agnostic on that, and that's beyond my technical expertise.
Okay, thank you. Next, Joe Bankoff asks, what role, if any, can the United States play in addressing the February crunch in the European Union?
Well, that's a really good question. And I think a lot of attention's been on, somehow the United States coming to the rescue with LNG. But everybody forgets that LNG is really in the hands in the United States of the commercial sector, and it operates according to market mechanisms. Yes, the US can create some incentives for that, but ultimately those are going to be company-based decisions. And, there's a premium associated with LNG. I think the role of the United States is to refocus on this next generation dimension and this long-term competition where resilience, encouraging resilience within Europe, resilience by building out those interconnectors so that they can take LNG from different parts of the world and their different existing ports more flexibly. To create resilience within each country such that cyber and other kinds of attacks on the energy infrastructure can easily be mitigated. Those are things that those countries should be paying for, but by framing resilience as a part of the broader Euro-Atlantic security architecture and actually part of deterrence. So we're not just talking about denial, punishment, or reassurance, but resilience is actively engaged as part of the way to contend with Russia and whatever complexion it looks like after this war. That's the role that the United States can play, is creating that architecture such that other countries that have much more direct interest in standing up, protecting their energy infrastructure can see that as part of the security architecture moving forward. And then creating incentives on their margins for companies to if they have to make an equal choice between, let's say, an Asian customer and a European customer, there may be some inducements there. But at the end of the day, the United States government is not going to be directing LNG to come to the rescue here. So I think that's not where we should be focusing our attention.
Okay, this next question also focuses on the issue of energy infrastructure. Olavi Ahrens asks, or he says, besides Orban's Hungary, there are a number of countries in Central Europe, including Austria or the Balkans, without seacoasts and hence cannot build LNG facilities. Are you saying that interconnectors cover the whole need in the area, or is is it something that will be needed, or will further connectors be needed?
I think the focus is primarily on Southern Europe, where there's more connection. Balkans in particular is where the attention is. I think up to now, it's sort of been that Central European area between Italy and Austria and Bulgaria and Hungary. I think there's been a lot built out there as part of the EU's infrastructure plan. So I would argue that it's going to be in the Balkans, because the Balkans could be, ripe for Russia to play off and using their different instruments of influence there. So I would say that's a function. I also tying some of the LNG facilities in Spain and Portugal, making it more cost effective to deliver LNG supply coming up, let's say in the future from Eastern Med or Persian Gulf to plug into those spaces. So I think that's where the focus should be. I think they've made a tremendous progress over the last decade, but it would primarily be Southern Europe.
And on the subject of infrastructure, you mentioned gray zone types of tactics as a possible weapon for Russia going forward. And of course, we all have heard about the explosions in the NS2 pipeline under the Baltic that we don't know for sure, but it's suspected that Russia might have been responsible for that. What's the threat to this energy infrastructure network that you're talking about that from other similar types of operations going forward? Some people interpreted the NS2 explosions as a warning signal to the EU, and that it happened the very same day that Poland and Norway celebrated the opening of this new Baltic connector, and that maybe it was a warning that we can also hit that if we want to. So does this pose a real threat? What do you see as the likelihood that Russia might undertake such operations?
Well, I think that's my reading of the situation, that this is part of this gray zone or, next generation war approach. And this is a way of exerting pressure and letting, again, my view of the ways of Russia's coercion is much more indirect. It's not explicit. It's sort of a brinkmanship, gradual escalation of pressure, the way we think of things. But it's much more indirect, implicit, let you manipulate your decision making, your information space. You draw conclusions that are convergent with their interests. So, the sabotage, I think, falls into that. And I think the message is exactly how you laid that out. Now, how resilient is the infrastructure? I think, again, obviously this new pipeline, there's going to be more attention to it. There are some really, in addition to the sabotage of the pipelines, there have been drones flying around the Norwegian platforms that have raised a lot of concern, that have been, that have arguably been even more concerned than the Nord Stream 2 explosions. So I think this is part of that effort. But again, this has to be seen in the context of the escalation of the war in Ukraine. And this also has to be seen as increasingly limited instruments of Russia's influence over these countries. So, as I said, as resilience becomes seen not just as a domestic issue, but as a strategic issue and as part of the deterrence against Russia, that will become less and less of an issue. The more diversified the supply, the more interconnectors there are, the more LNG and pipeline routes there are coming into Europe, the less concern that becomes, or the less, I wouldn't say concern, but the less damaging to Europe's overall calculus. So again, these are, I wouldn't poo-poo them. I think it's very much in line with the coercive strategy that they're adopting, but how effective this is, I would question. And you don't see a balking. In fact, you see a decision by the countries to move forward with the investigation without Russia on the explosion. You're looking at increasingly drawing attention to potentially those drone flights. And this is actually a question about what the US can do. Well, this may be where the US Navy has a role in protecting some of these platforms and patrolling some of these areas, because these are not easy activities, especially the undersea types of strikes. That's why a lot of folks are gravitating towards Russia as the culprit here, because it's very difficult to mount these kinds of problems. And really, the problems aren't so much the explosion; it's the water getting in the pipelines and some of those problems at Nord Stream. And actually, because of the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, there's really no future moving forward. So those pipelines were pretty much gone. And Nord Stream 1 is kind of an interesting dynamic, as you mentioned, but it doesn't seem like there are any takers to Mr. Putin's offers right now, largely because his reputation is shot. So I see this as hiccups as part of the escalation of the war right now. I see this as the challenge for Europe moving forward, but putting resilience front and center in a containment deterrence type of strategy.
Okay. Yeah, we have a question from an anonymous attendee that gets to the issue of diversity of energy supplies. Do you see foresee Europe forging closer ties to the Middle East and OPEC nations due to this issue? I guess the current energy crisis.
Well, I think Europe's real interest is less with some of the OPEC states in the Gulf. It's more Eastern Med and the prospects for the Eastern Med there, and getting tied into Europe either through some sort of Middle Eastern pipeline that may come up through Italy or through LNG capabilities. And so I do think Europe is getting more and more interested in the plays that are involving Lebanon and Israel, Greece, Turkey and Cyprus. So I mean, it's a confluence of an interesting set of dynamics that I think is of large interest. Also, the Black Sea is obviously another area of interest for Europe. So yeah, Europe will be buying and be affected by Middle East and OPEC plus oil prices because oil is a global integrated market, so they can't avoid that. But they're not unique in that regard. So I don't see any kind of sweetheart deals or other types of arrangements there that would be beyond the market kinds of arrangements. But again, Eastern Med, I think, provides an interesting dynamic to diversify, especially their natural gas supply, which still has a regional dimension to it. It's not fully global like the oil sector is.
Okay. Yeah, Tony asks if you wouldn't mind, could you expand on the effects of reputation in determining national suppliers of critical inputs and how lessons from Russian energy might change how countries perceive their supply relationships, especially as the world enters an era of great power competition. I guess we could add to that how the US might view Saudi Arabia going forward, given their
I mean, this is a great question. I don't really have a good answer, but I would say, you know, the distinctive element of Soviet and Russian European energy relations was that Russia forged, and Soviet Union, then Russia forged a reputation as a reliable supplier. That helped them navigate the, you know, changing winds in the strategic relationships. That relationship, that reputation, I think, has been shot by this war. So, and you're seeing, as you just mentioned, Michael, I think the US-Saudi relationship is being recalibrated. And so how these reputations are going to get forged is going to be interesting, but they're going to be taking place in a dynamic energy landscape as well. So it's not just sort of going back to the way it was, right? We're going to be seeing the energy transition and who are going to be the winners and losers of that. And as I mentioned, if renewable hydrocarbons are a big part of that story, well, then I think it offers a lot of diversity opportunities, and reputation may not, you know, maybe it'll matter, but maybe that'll just be much more of a market opportunity and liberalized trading set of opportunities. But if countries bank on certain renewables that are going to require, or certain batteries that are going to require certain mineral sources and raw materials, that may lead to the need to establish other types of more subjective relations around those material supply bases. And, you know, here's where the China dimension comes in as well. So I think we're in a very fluid state where a lot of the reputational issues are now just as dynamic as the material-based relationships. And so we'll have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you. Another question from an anonymous attendee, but they ask you to elaborate more about the myth regarding Russia's energy statecraft being uniformly successful. I guess why this myth existed in the first place, perhaps.
Well, I mean, I wrote a book on this exact problem during the 90s and the 2000s. And, I was looking at, first off, we tend to talk about energy as if there's one energy source. And obviously, as we've been talking here, there's oil, natural gas, and commercial nuclear are the main instruments that were being implicated in any kind of non-commercial element of statecraft by Russia. And when we look at the empirical record, they failed miserably on the times that they tried to exert oil statecraft, both over consumers and rival suppliers. That led to more of a diversification of those other states' relationships, either with other supply relationships or other customers for Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan or whatever. So they have failed. They consistently failed on oil. Natural gas, there were some cases of success, as we talked about in the Baltic states and Moldova and Armenia, Ukraine. But even there, the successes were less about turning off the spigot. And in fact, when they turned off the spigot, it led to more diversification. And that was, they were too heavy-handed there. Commercial nuclear, I would argue they sort of got it just right. If you're thinking about the Goldilocks dilemma there, because they kept it commercial. They used their commercial leverage to get into, and they didn't try to exact more political concessions. And so they were able to expand their customer base for commercial nuclear reactors and to reconstitute a supply relationship of uranium with Kazakhstan. And so I think the point is you have to disaggregate, you have to understand the political economies of these different sectors, understand where Russia had some market power, market share, varied tremendously. Russia, as I mentioned, was not a swing producer in oil. it was a regional gas player in Europe with, but for a while, but now with LNG and and it built out of the interconnectors, even that is relaxed. And in commercial nuclear energy space, especially in the Middle East and parts of Southeast Asia, they made some headway. But I would argue at the end of the day, these are not potent instruments of this sort of next generation war moving forward.
Adam, let me ask you a question about the future. It's hard to envision right now, given everything going on, but what's the possibility that down the road, after the Ukraine war is resolved somehow, that Russia, perhaps under new management, gets back into the game as an energy supplier for Europe? I mean, obviously there'll be some reluctance among Europeans to become as dependent as they have been on Russian energy, but what's the, we're talking about diversification of energy supplies as being the golden goal. What role might Russian energies play in the future in Europe's energy mix? Here again, getting past everything going on right now, and I know that's kind of hard to predict possibly, but do you see this rupture in energy ties between Europe and Russia as being permanent?
Well, in addition to the reputational hits that Russia's taken, I mean, I think your companies have been de-risking, and we've seen even with Iran, even when we warm up in the JCPOA agreement, it's hard to get companies to go back and take such risks. And so I think we've got to, even in the best of circumstances, like in the conditions that you just mentioned, if we assume those, I think it's going to be hard to get the private sector to get back there in a big way. That said, and we're going to be seeing an energy transition in Russia's established markets. So yes, I think Russia's future is going to be tied more to providing some hydrocarbons to China and India, but they're going to hedge, and they're gravitating to Russia because the price is right right now. They're going to extract their pound of flesh from Russia. But in terms of the West, I mean, I do think we need to be thinking exactly about this question right now. Because there's very little that we can really affect on the ground other than providing the military assistance. We're not going to be dictating the terms of whatever settlement, but it's hard to imagine that any settlement on the ground is going to be satisfactory to the warring parties. And so we're going to need to be thinking about a bigger architecture that's going to create incentives to make whatever the equilibrium on the ground palatable. And for Russia and the energy equation, it's not going to be buying gas from Russia. I mean, that may be to some extent, but Europe's transitioning away from that. Again, I think Russia understood that. That's why they're going to such extreme measures in their energy coercion in this next generation war now. But in the future, I would say, to the extent that renewable hydrocarbons has a future in Europe, and I would argue that this is critical for accelerating or meeting the European targets, Russia could play a role in that, with its nuclear, helping to power some of that infrastructure, helping to provide some of the converted, use that their vast reserves that exist that have already been tapped, and to, not necessarily developing new fields, but to take the edge off of that transition, but integrating it into the renewable hydrocarbon context. If they don't do that, I just don't see it as it's not an attractive investment for anyone, and it's going to be hard to attract investment there. This is really, I would argue, the legacy of Vladimir Putin. He had what any political leader would have coveted, which was stability. He had legitimacy. He had popularity. He could have made very difficult decisions to transition them from being a gas depot for their country and for Europe. And he chose to double down on that and now we're in this situation. It's very difficult to see how Russia is going to be an enticing investment. It's going to be a driver in the energy transition. It's going to be an appendage, and it's going to have to make hard decisions, but it's going to be making hard decisions with weak leadership, which is not a good recipe for a lot of stability moving forward. And so I'm not all that optimistic that energy is going to be the real instrument for Russia's salvation to come back into the fold.
Okay, I think we have some additional, oh, Alistair, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure I'm sort of understanding an argument that I think is that you've been making. As in the past, you argued that the mutual dependence between the EU and Russia led to an exercise of strategic restraint by both parties. So Russia didn't cut off gas to EU, and the EU didn't cut off, stop importing. And what we have in this situation, that's now broken down, right? So the war. So my interpretation of what I think you're saying is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was such an egregious act that Europe lost faith in Russia and has been both moving to punish Russia with the planned curtailment of oil imports and actively, seeking to reduce dependence by reducing gas supply. And Russia, seeing the writing on the wall, is now, so the Europeans have sort of like, they took off the restraint, and the Russians, seeing that the writings on the wall, are now trying to cut off the Europeans. But they're going to lose the money in the long run. They've lost the reputation, so they're now cutting off supplies in an attempt to impose a cost on Europe before the weapon is gone. Would that be?
Yeah, that's what and in the context of the war in Ukraine, right, where they're trying to escalate in a way that's not, not focusing on the nuclear dimension, but escalating here to bring the war home to Europeans to try to exploit some of those fissures. But as I mentioned, I think that's not working. I don't see any evidence of that, but your way you summarize that is right. I think it was very clear between, and we can argue about when exactly between 2014 and 2022 was the case, but I think it was very clear that Europe was moving away from Russia. Europe was the coveted market. Russia had not invested. The timelines were not right with China. They couldn't rely on China to easily substitute for Europe in a timely fashion. Ukraine was not playing ball. And as a result, they doubled down on, and they, of course, were caught by surprise by the resilience of the Ukrainians, as we all know. And they went to go for a knockout punch early on with a shock and awe kind of way. And that didn't work. And now they're in a war. Now we're escalating. And so they're using these energy levers, which are no longer, their time horizons for energy are now very much constricted, as opposed to before they were much longer term. And that's what I think has really fundamentally changed. And Europe is now moved away from a shorter term, just focusing on the short term price relationship with Russia and having kind of long-term confidence in that, to now they got to move away from Russia. And they can't even rely on them to get through the winter.
Okay. Got another question that is timely because the European Commission just released its enlargement report, but it asks if you could expand on the challenges that the Balkan states may experience from waning off of Russian energy, especially those that remain candidate members of the EU and may not fully be protected by that network.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great, I think the Balkans is where you're going to see the vestiges of, Russia trying to stoke and use energy to try to exploit those, especially those outside of the European Union process. And obviously we see with the elections in the Balkans that this is a volatile domain. But I guess those that make it into EU are going to benefit from all of the interconnectors and all the things that we're talking about. And those that are not are going to still be the sort of targets of opportunity for the whatever Russia, the legacy, coercive behavior of Russia, they'll seek to exploit. So, I think that's where the vestiges of Russia's great power dynamics in Europe are going to start to play out. But probably it will be more reflective of Russia's weakness than its strength. But I don't know. I'm not an expert on the different domestic politics in those countries, so I don't know who will prevail. But it's but if you look at the record to date, Russia has not really really had much success beyond short-term episodic
Okay, yeah, I have another question for you, Adam, that I don't fully understand what's going on, but there's this MidCat, speaking of interconnectors, there's this MidCat interconnector linking the Iberian Peninsula, Spain, and Portugal with Germany to provide, I guess is it LNG coming into Iberian ports that the French government, they want to build it across the Pyrenees through France into Germany, but the French government is blocking that. And I guess Spain and Germany are considering different options for how to route the connector. But do you know what the issues are there exactly?
No, I'm not an expert on the French dimension. I mean, in the broad scheme of things, this was what the problem, in 2006 and 2009, it wasn't that Europe broadly, conceived of, didn't have natural gas. They just couldn't get natural gas to where the demand was. And the Iberian coastline was it had a lot of, that's where the LNG facilities were, but there were really no interconnectors. And so now there have been some, but France is playing, it has its own games. And I don't know exactly why they're, what the issue is of this particular pipeline. So I defer to my European colleagues on that, but that's been one of the success stories here in terms of defanging Russia. So it is an interesting dynamic, but it also may be reflective of the notion that for the other parts of Europe, there's a kind of a confidence now in the interconnectors that currently exist, and that there may be other, less strategic reasons for this particular acrimony.
Okay, thank you. One more question from Simon Key. Given the threats to Ukrainian nuclear reactors during the war, why would a post-war Ukraine not want to move away from this technology in favor of renewables? And I guess this gets also to the security issues surrounding nuclear power overall and the potential for sabotage. And so is this not in the end still a risky energy source? Well,
I mean, obviously the war is raised to the fore a threat that frankly we didn't ever think about, especially in terms of the energy security, is that great power is actually targeting nuclear power plants as part of an element of war, waging war. So yeah, there are a lot of concerns, but in terms of Ukraine, they're still very bullish about nuclear power, just like they were after Chernobyl. I mean, this is, there's an attitude towards nuclear power and its prospects in Ukraine that are very different in other parts of the world. And they see nuclear power. I mean, the Zaporizhzhia power plant was integral and tied into European gas grid. They see this as the material manifestation of Ukraine's integration with the West. And this is something that Ukraine can give, that there's much more reluctance in Germany and other countries to do this. So this is their comparative advantage that they see. Plus, they have invested heavily in it. And yes, this is war right now. And I don't know that we can draw inferences about Ukraine's perspective on the future of nuclear energy based on the destruction and the terrorist strikes that Russia is waging on them now, because they see that as actually, they call this terrorism. They don't see that, if terrorism was going to change everything, we would see, much of the landscape in many countries change. But, that's not, I think that this is treated differently. And there's a culture around energy, nuclear energy in Ukraine that's just different than in other parts of even Central Europe. Not to mention Western Europe. And so I think they see this as their comparative advantage.
Okay, and following up on that, another attendee asked if you think the entire situation, I guess they mean the energy crisis right now, will make Germany seriously reconsider nuclear energy.
Well, the question there is seriously. They already have reconsidered a little bit. They're now postponing the decommissioning of some of those, power plants. But, again, my view is that the future of nuclear energy in Europe has to be seen as integrated into an all of the above architecture. And I would argue that renewable hydrocarbons bring both the bad word hydrocarbon and nuclear, another bad word. So they need to get some sort of ad agency here for those two sectors to get those two bad words out of the framing of it. But at the end of the day, those two sectors, I think, are going to have to be integrated into the energy transition. But to the extent that countries do not accept that, it's going to be a real challenge. So, yes, and Germany has been kind of speaking out of both sides of their mouth for a while, right? They were talking about moving to wind and renewables, yet still buying a lot of Russian gas. And oh, by the way, buying power from France that was generated by nuclear. So, we need to face these issues and be more pragmatic about it. But whether or not the politics are going to take us there, maybe in Germany. But again, this is where if you have all of the above architecture and countries like Ukraine can actually play that role, then maybe nuclear power doesn't need to be front and center in a country like Germany. Maybe in Poland where it comes in, or as well, or Hungary that may be playing these roles rather than where in other countries. So that's where I'm talking about. We need to have much more of a all of the above architecture that is the focal point that allow for comparative advantages and different energy security cultures to play their role in that process. So you're not bumping up against the weaknesses or the aversions in different nodes in that architecture.
Okay, well, you started out the presentation talking about realism, so maybe that's a good, you kind of circle back to it there, discussing maybe the future role of nuclear energy in Europe's energy mix. Also interesting to note, of course, that Germany has a Green Party energy and economy minister right now, so that's making some of these decisions. So be interesting to see the impact of the burdens of responsibility in office on that decision making there. But I guess we're almost out of time. I don't think there's any further questions. If any, we maybe have time for one more if somebody would like to.
Let me just add one point about the German question, and it really has to do with Europe in general. As long as the debates are about the sources of clean energy and not about the full costs of clean energy, such as the transmission and storage, that it'll be hard for nuclear to get off the dime in places like Germany. But if we focus, and like you said, as politicians become responsible for realizing those targets and realizing the costs of the transmission infrastructure and storage for renewables by themselves to meet those targets, I think there's a possibility. So again, it's reframing the conversation away from the production and more towards the transmission and storage and the full costs of renewables and the full opportunities for and all of the above infrastructure that I think can change. But whether or not we're there, I mean, this is the challenge. Are they going to just confront the trilemma? Or are they going to transcend the trilemma? And I would argue that this infrastructure, this renewable hydrocarbon infrastructure provides the all of the above architecture to transcend that dilemma.
Okay, if you're willing, we have one more question. I think that ties into what you just talked about, maybe overlaps somewhat with what you just were talking about. But an attendee asked, to what extent do you believe the energy crisis is highlighting Europe's shortcomings on meeting demands for sustainable energy?
Well, like I said, I think it highlights the excessive attention to production and not the holistic costs of the transition. And we need to focus on the carriers and the storage, which are huge. And frankly, when we start focusing on those costs, then we realize our investments today in diversifying away from Russia are not going to be stranded assets and lost money. They'll be part of that energy transition that could actually help us get there faster. But yeah, to the extent that we continue the way we were conframing it, then I think they're not going to meet those demands.
So you moved from realism to constructivism. They're talking about framing, so that's
Beauty of it.
Well, I think we have to end it there. We're close to the end of our time, but I want to thank everybody for participating and attending. We had, I think, a good turnout here, close to 30 attendees. Thank you for your participation and attention. But Dr. Adam Stulberg, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation and discussion. I think we all learned quite a bit more about Russia's use of energy as a weapon and how successful or not that's been, but also quite a bit more about the current energy crisis and the future prospects facing Europe in that regard. So thank you very much for your time, and we appreciate it greatly.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. See you next week.